Your cult boyfriend, and I want to talk to you today about Metropolitan, a 1990 film directed by Whit Stillman, who The Last Days of Disco is one of my favorite movies ever made. And by the way, Metropolitan is a masterpiece. It's fucking beautiful and I love it. I finally watched it for the first time recently. And yeah, I fell in love with it. I've watched it quite a few times since then. It's an extremely watchable film. I loved it so much. The angst was touching, the social alienation felt sincere. I felt exposed by Chris Eigman's performance in it. Seriously, I related to Nick Smith a lot. Uh, it's a wonderfully written, wonderfully composed, wonderfully directed, and wonderfully acted film. Uh, Whit Stillman seems to, through his films, provide us with portraits of um, a certain subculture or a certain piece of like the American pop culture, of youth culture that is in its death throes. I'm basing this on having only seen two films at this point, but The Last Days of Disco is certainly about the final days of the disco movement and how the yuppie scum deserve their redemption too. And Metropolitan is similar in its themes in that while we're not talking about disco, we are talking about the young preppy bourgeoisie, uh, well, posing as bourgeoisie. Some of these kids are of limited resources financially, uh, but it's about debutante balls, debutante society, and a strange amount of choreographed social interactions, and they make a point of saying that these kinds of contrived social interactions, these theatrical ones, they are some of the first introductions into society that the young girls involved here have experienced. And in the case of Audrey, I think Audrey can really embody the kind of integrity, the purity, or maybe not even the purity. That might be a bit off base. It's the heart. She's the heart of the entire movement, and I think Whit Stillman looks at these groups like the disco movement or the debutantes of old Manhattan society, and he can see the value within privileged scenarios. He wants to lament and give dignity to groups of people that have gone unconsidered, have gone unseen in an artistic and philosophical way. And it's through characters like Nick Smith. There's a great deal of self awareness to these kids, even through all of their pontificating and all of their extremely practiced social gestures and mores and um, extremely practiced social and romantic movements. There's a truth to them. There's a truth to each and every one of them. Nick Smith speaks my truth of being incredibly self-aware, very obnoxious, but also I think like hyper intelligent, which makes him hyper confrontational because I think he feels extremely insecure, and that being invited to this level of society gives him a sense of order in a chaotic, barbaric modern world. And I think that's why I like Nick Smith so much. He's also incredibly funny, and I think he's incredibly touching. And I believe that Whit Stillman is a wonderful writer, considering that this follows my favorite structure for any dramatic piece, especially if we're talking about coming of age stories, which Metropolitan certainly is one. I like the Mercutio archetypes. I like having a character in the piece that the piece insists on so much, that the piece is kind of motivated by. Nick Smith is the guiding, determined force of of the first two acts of the film, right? Like he is there and he is moving everything forward in a philosophical way, in a political way, in a social way, in a visceral way that really connects with the audience, and in intellectual ways as well. And of course, he's removed from us before the climax, before the third act, and his departure signals in a more tragic tone to the film because once Nick has been forced to go back upstate to see his stepmother and father, um, we really do see the death rattle of this society and how it kind of disintegrates and it's falling apart. And you have these aimless people who still believe in some empty modality of virtue, but at least they believe in virtue. And at least they fall in love with girls who learned what love was through Jane Austen, and I think there is a deep, sensual, integrity to that kind of romantic and social fixation. But once Nick leaves, yeah, it takes a more tragic tone, and things are more disparate. Things are more removed from each other, and uh, the 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 debutante society has fallen apart. The Deb society is through. It's over. The last days of Debs. And of course, that is like, Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet when he's removed from us at the end of the second act. It ushers in the tragedy that will overwhelm the remainder of Shakespeare's play. And you can see Mercutio elements being used like in Disturbing Behavior, in the musical Rent, in Spring Awakening as well, and The Godfather with Sonny. Like, it's all over the place, and I think it's probably the most powerful tool that you can utilize if you are telling a tragedy. And Metropolitan, I think, is telling a tragedy. It's a tragic comedy, just like The Last Days of Disco was, but I feel like Metropolitan is a lot more tragic in the sense that, at least in The Last Days of Disco, there was a certain amount of decadence. Kate Beckinsale and Chloe Sevigny and like Matt Kiesler and even Chris Eichman in that film, they all participated in the erotic tapestry of the disco movement. They all participated in some of the more sexual liberating characteristics that defined disco in the 70s. But this Deb society that we're seeing in Metropolitan, it is incredibly limited and restricted when it comes to uh, engaging in romantic conquest, engaging in romantic trysts. Like you have to make declarations, or there's a character called Von Sloniker that Nick completely despises, and I believe for good reasons, even though he exaggerates and tells lies about Von Sloniker. He uses composites of different women that Von Sloniker is said to have abused and driven to suicide. And I think in a larger way, Nick is saying that people like Von Sloniker are driving the Deb Society as a whole to kill itself. Um, in a morbid tribute to this new kind of more dangerous rock and roll long hair, but extremely rich and fake. The fake sensitivity of Von Sloniker will destroy uh, the feminine dignity of the Deb society of this this upper crust kind of society of manners. And most of these um, young people involved with the society seem to be incredibly restricted and insecure sexually, and it is. I think that's what makes it kind of tragic, but what also makes it so sweet, because at the end of the film, when Charlie and Tom rescue in their minds, they rescue, and they truly do. They rescue Audrey from Von Sloniker's Northampton beach house or whatever. Um, it's a pretty decent moment. He's even holding like an antique gun as a way of intimidation, and the fact that it is antique, I think, speaks poetic volumes because that he is doing something that's archaic. He is the last defender of a dead ritual at this point, and he's trying to save the very heart and soul of it in Audrey. And he does, but when he has her on the beach, he is talking a bit more truthfully, but he's still pontificating. He's still insecure. He's still restricted in his limited idea of love, of art and literature, and of romantic timing. But there is something a bit more immediate to his words, even though they are still verbose and kind of insensitive. They're there, and he's trying, and I think he definitely loves Audrey at that point. Fascinatingly, Tom hasn't read any Jane Austen. He hasn't read like War and Peace. Hasn't read any Tolstoy. He doesn't read fiction, but he reads critical analysis of fiction, which is fucking hilarious. It is a funny film. I think it's a lovely film with incredible performances, and yeah, I related. I identified with Nick quite a bit. Um, I can be a self-destructive postmodern rat at times, and I saw a lot of myself in Nick's violent, obnoxious faux pas, the social ones and the sexual ones. Um, I saw a lot of myself in Nick, and I think that's really beautiful and really kind of the film to speak to me so deeply. And I liked how much Metropolitan resonated with me as a coming of age tale. It's entirely incredibly sophisticated. Coming of age is a deconstruction of youth, but in Whit Stillman's universe, which seems to be so all encompassing, it's an entire portrait of this movement, of this group of people that once existed and once thrived and once were just as odd and contagiously affectionate as any other group. It's not simply just a deconstruction of youth in Whit Stillman's science. It's a deconstruction of culture as it stands, as it stood, and how it always seems in an idealized form. It's a deconstruction of nearly everything for Whit Stillman because he's not just fixated and focused on the players involved. He's curious. He's at least affectionately curious about the concept of cultures, movements for young people, movements within youth being failures, or are they successful? What determines failure in the larger eyes of culture as a whole and culture as we know it. And while it refuses to make any direct statements there, well, it makes us go back to a, a micro level. And we can say, I believe in Charlie, Tom, and Audrey walking down the side of the road, can't catch a ride. No one's going to pick up these last vestiges of the Deb Society, of the UHB. No one's going to pick up the last of the urban bourgeoisie. Who could? But there's a discreet charm to them, isn't there? And while I don't think symbolically those remaining few ever got a ride to continue, I like to imagine them frozen in that existential inertia of stasis that Whit Stillman ends Metropolitan with, that freeze frame. And I like to imagine that they are doing their best to be authentic, that authenticity and dignity are constantly opposed forces in the modern world. And I have to admire those people who, even though they seem restricted and disingenuous, they're trying to be authentic while trying to be dignified because nothing causes you to lose your dignity more than being obnoxiously authentic. Sometimes it's not about the thing, it's about its representation. I think that's what Nick Smith and I and Whit Stillman understand the most. That its representation could be just as meaningful as it. But yeah, I loved this film. Beautiful cinematography, beautiful composition, beautifully written, beautifully acted, just a masterpiece. 1990s Metropolitan. I couldn't recommend this film in a higher degree. I think it's beautiful and you should definitely watch it. One of the greatest coming of age films that I have ever seen, and I've seen plenty. Uh, yeah, one of the 10 best teen movies, or, coming of age movies. I shouldn't say teen, but it's one of the best coming of age movies of all time. Do yourself a favor and watch it if you haven't already. It's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful, and I'm shocked, but also really happy that it took me so long to finally watch it because I think I'm at a point in my life where I can fully engage and interact with it, and the way that the philosophy of the film develops really just kind of reached out to me, and I was felt by just about every component of Metropolitan. So thank you. I've been your cult boyfriend, and I believe that's all I have to say about this film, which is it's a stunning work, masterful to the core.